Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our Student Spotlight series, where we're able to showcase some of the work that our past students have been doing. So I'm Daphne. I'm one of the podcast hosts here at CCIR, and it's our pleasure to have with us today Hanna. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, like how old you are, how long you've been with CCIR, what grade you're in, things like this.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, my name is Hannah. I'm 17 years old, and I did the CCIR mentorship program over the summer of year 11 and year 12. So I just did it this past summer, and I'm currently in year 12. And I did it in international relations, and I did it on the topic of Crimea and how it was annexed in 2014. And I explored it under the kind of a consideration of international law, Ukrainian law, and also the principle of self-determination and territorial integrity. And my mentor was Dr. Pratsinakis from Oxford University.
Amazing. That sounds really, really fascinating and very relevant in today's current news. How did you find the experience working with a professor? How was that different to what you're normally used to in school? And had you done anything similar? How did you find that kind of experience? Was it new? Was it quite easy? Was it challenging?
I think the part that I found the most challenging is kind of being able to find my own kind of perspective on the topic. Because I initially came into writing the research with some kind of biased assumptions, and I ended up changing my mind about a lot of them. But I found the experience, I think it was very interesting, and it was a very important experience for me because it definitely helped my writing, and it definitely also helped me kind of develop in the research field. And and I think for me, maybe the hardest part of the whole of the process was the literature review because I was aware of the topic, and I came into the first meeting with a proposal of this specific topic, but I wasn't as knowledgeable as I should have been in order to write that topic. So I think the literature part was the most interesting, but also the hardest because a lot of the secondary kind of articles they can find on Google Scholar, they all have different opinions. So it's kind of hard to find your own kind of extension on the topic. And I kind of tried to combine a lot of the perspectives that I was able to read about and then kind of found my own as well.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah. Had you done like similar projects before, like in school? I guess you're maybe used to a much larger group environment and much less independent. Was that kind of different educational atmosphere challenging for you, or did you kind of just step right into it? How was that for you?
I don't think it was challenging, but in the past I have done some research. I wrote a paper on global policy on a kind of a similar topic, concerned a similar area because my first paper was on global policy when it comes to NATO's engagement in the war in Ukraine. So when I first wrote that, it was it was very interesting for me to look at that and then kind of look at the very kind of inherent causes of the things that I was talking about in my first paper. That's what kind of led me to writing this. But when it comes to it being challenging, I don't think it was, but it might be obviously because I have written some things in the past. But it was obviously also very kind of growing and a very interesting and an academic experience.
No, definitely. That sounds really, really interesting. So I would love to get into your paper now. Yeah, so I would love to hear about how you chose this topic and how you kind of went about it. So like kind of walk me through your paper as if I know absolutely nothing about it and just kind of give me the kind of very step-by-step lowdown. Yeah.
So the very topic of my research is the 2014 annexation of Crimea. So to kind of simplify it, Crimea is the region that's kind of in between the majority of Russia and continental kind of just Ukraine. The region is in between, and in the past, historically, has been native to some Tatar groups and other native groups that are related to the Tatars, but also have some ethnic relations to Turkey. And the region was annexed in 2014 following an invasion, then an occupation, and then kind of like a referendum, which is the kind of the very primary thing that I examine in my paper. And then after the kind of disputed referendum, it was illegally annexed by Russia. And so a lot of people actually consider that to be the very start of the war that is ongoing today, because it was a military invasion, and it's obviously kind of hard to pinpoint when the war started. But my paper is based on, first I kind of had to figure out my criteria. So what I was looking at and how I was judging it. So it came down to international law, kind of regional respective, in that case, Ukrainian law, and also the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity. So I'll start with some of these, I'll break that down. So for international law, as an example, I looked at how a lot of countries kind of view democracy as a standard. So, for example, obviously it was illegal. It was an illegal move for Russia to annex Crimea, but the way that you kind of like break it down, and that's what I did in my research, is it's hard to expect a country to uphold the kind of the standards of a democracy. And that's what I examined as well. But I came to the ultimate conclusion when it comes to international law, that the kind of the recognition of Crimea as Russian is really the basis of what international law kind of looks like in these situations. So I compared that to the situation of Kosovo as well. For Crimea, a lot of the countries that recognize it as Russian and recognize it right now as well are primarily the allies of Russia. A lot of them also are in the BRICS alliance. So for instance, I believe it's, Iran, South Africa, yeah, I mean, and Serbia as well. There's quite a bit, and they recognize Crimea as Russian, and therefore, I mean, from their perspective, Crimea is Russian and is part of Russia. But from the perspective, I don't know, Poland, Germany, or even the United States, they'll say otherwise, but that's because they don't recognize it. But in the case of Kosovo, it was a bit different because the recognition, was recognized by the majority of kind of democratic countries of what you may kind of view as a democratic country. And so, and also was decided by the International Court of Justice that was also, recognized. So I think what I came down to, and what I think this was actually the hardest part of my research, because a lot of different articles say different things about this, and they do focus on international law quite a lot. And so for me, it's hard to kind of come down to a more kind of original conclusion, kind of at my extension on it. But it ultimately, for me, came down to recognizing international law not as a very direct law, but more so as a standard and as a means of like how countries recognize others when it comes to these events. And then I also looked at respective law. So I kind of analyzed the Ukrainian constitution. And for as an example, the referendum that was organized by Russia, it was organized only in the region of Crimea. So it was organized only in that kind of tiny part of Ukraine. Whereas, the Ukrainian constitution states that if such an event should happen, first of all, it should be issued per the authority of the Ukrainian president or the Supreme Council of Ukraine. And then it should also be kind of basically all citizens of Ukraine should have a say in such referendums. And it first of all not being organized unilaterally, and then being also organized only in the region of Crimea. That obviously they're major breaches of law, and that's why it's not considered to be legal in Ukraine or globally anywhere really. And then the kind of the last two things that I looked at is self-determination and territorial integrity. So the two principles are, they sound exclusionary because self-determination allows nations, communities, or smaller states to kind of literally like self-determine themselves into, joining a different nation or a different state, whereas territorial integrity kind of protects, maybe not protects them from doing so, but kind of just protects their boundaries. They're kind of also often protects them from abuse of like greater nations, like in the case of Russia and Ukraine. So first, and I examined how they can kind of intersect, because in the case of the Crimean Referendum in 2014, the annexation obviously was kind of based on the assumption that, the kind of the Russian government is almost saving the Crimeans who really want to be a part of Russia. And some of these assumptions are true. There are people who live or have lived in Crimea before 2014, in the period where it was considered to be Ukrainian by, all countries. And they want it to be a part of Russia. That's an undeniable part. Um, but at the same time, there are people who still want it to be a part of Ukraine. And when it comes to self-determination, Russia almost made it look like the whole of Crimea really wanted to be a part of Russia. That's why they organized a referendum, a democratic process after all. And, they framed it in a way that made it looked like they were really saving Crimea, and like they were really saving the Crimean people. And, when it comes to these semi-democratic processes, I think it's very important to have that distinction of like abuse from other countries, but at the same time, these smaller nations still retaining their independence in these processes. Because here, obviously, it wasn't retained, and yeah, we're here. But when it comes to territorial integrity, that should really protect that nation from not being not being a, not being a victim of abuse from such countries. And the very intersection that I kind of found is those semi-democratic processes that are illegal and are kind of framed in a way that helps Russia look better. They simply shouldn't exist. But at the same time, I also looked like for kind of the history of Russia versus Chechnya, like they also requested to become independent, and that request was ignored by Russia and the government. So I think it's important to kind of look at the past as well, because the way that many people may so consider it is to be self-determination when it wasn't. So I would encourage everyone to kind of look at the past and kind of look at these similarities, because obviously it was a kind of a hypocritical move as well.
This is really, really, really interesting. And I think you've explained this situation perfectly. It's not an easy one to explain. So that is very well said. Firstly, I want to commend you on that. And I've written down some thoughts while you were speaking. Once again, very, very well said. And I want to just kind of delve into a few of the things that you were saying, because there's a lot there, and there's a lot that I think people don't know and don't understand maybe. So I want to first quickly define international law versus respective law, and how do you define the relationship between international law once we define it, and kind of this idea of international law, and how countries interact with each other under this international law. Like, I think when someone throws around the world international law, we think of international war crimes, the Hague getting involved, things like that, the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
So can you just please define for us international law and respective law?
So I think, obviously respective law and kind of local law is far different from international law, because like, for instance, when I was looking at the Ukrainian constitution, that's respective law in that case, I was looking at one, maybe two documents. Whereas for international law, it very much depends on the country, because you have countries that are member states of the United Nations or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the European Union, and then they have certain standards that they should uphold as a result. And similarly, you have conventions on human rights. You have the Genevan Convention, right? Like that's also, but countries by signing those conventions, they also kind of they're expected to uphold some of these standards. So I had to really dig a bit deeper and kind of look at the conventions, at certain treaties that the countries have signed, and just see how that kind of aligns with what they have done. And again, like to kind of look at the situation even from a more complex point of view, you have a country doing illegal stuff on the land of a different country. So it's even harder to define, because we should be looking at Russia's kind of a standing within international law, but at the same time at Ukraine's, because it was done at the time, and I guess presently as well, on Ukrainian land. So for me, it was also, I said it majorly relies on the recognition that the event receives. Because in the case of Crimea, it didn't really receive much recognition. That's why it's not considered to be legal by international law, nor by respective law. But I think that's a lot more obvious because when it comes to, respective local law, you have things like the Constitution and, just major documents that are a lot easier to kind of examine, especially that they concern specific nations and specific states. But I'd say that the major distinction for the two is that it's the respective law is much easier to apply. Whereas, when it comes to international law, you really have to consider it on a case by case basis, where some countries may be binded by certain standards that you may not know about, and some may not be.
Yes, I think that's an amazing answer as well. And I think the kind of distinction between international and respective law is a crucial one here. But also, I think there's even another layer once we understand all of this, that I think complicates the situation even more, which is that the kind of question of what happens when a country does not care about respective law or international law. Countries like Russia that are not democracies, what does one do then, right? Because they can kind of go around saying, this land is mine, this land is mine, France is mine, Germany should be mine, everything should be mine, right? And so that, I guess, is when you mentioned NATO and the allied powers. That's, I guess, the next step when these kinds of forces get involved. And I'm curious what you think about that instance. Like, how has your research kind of found the relationship, or like, what is the relationship between your research and this idea of countries that do not abide by international law whatsoever? What is the next step then? You know?
I mean, I think, and just kind of referring to the other paper that I wrote about NATO, I mean, it's a lot more complex because you see kind of a Western European or semi-Western European alliance where countries, like Poland, Germany, and then not United Kingdom, not anymore, but you see a lot of these countries like Spain, France, and etc. I'm not going to name all of them, but be members of the European Union and the NATO. I mean, I think they have a much stronger relationship, and that's why you kind of, you mean, so it's like with friends. I mean, you see the benefit in helping one another because, it's at one point it's a transactional relationship. So I think, right now, a lot of, when it comes to the current engagement of NATO in Ukraine, there's a lot of military supplies being sent there. Same with, a lot of money being sent there as well. But you see it through a transactional perspective. And I think, when it comes to countries being invaded and another country just saying that they don't care, again, it's, it should be evaluated on a case by case basis because it's very hard to apply, especially when it's, happening on different land as well, the respective law changes. And again, I think right now, I think it would be very hard if Russia was to attack the whole of Europe. You always have, right now, Ukraine is not in the NATO, although I think they will be following the war. Um, and if Russia was to go a bit more further, maybe attack Poland or on a different NATO state, they would be punished because the treaty kind of binds all member states to attack the country that invades the first country. So I mean, right now, I think it would be very hard to define what would happen if Russia kept on, invading Ukraine, because Ukraine is obviously in the NATO. And the way that the US is sending military supplies, or, even Poland, they definitely focus on it for a kind of transactional perspective. Because at the end of the day, a lot of countries may pose a threat, and, by sending supplies, you always get that kind of a possible thing they can get in return.
Right. No, yeah, definitely. I guess if you have a treaty, that kind of is a binding agreement that, should anything happen to any one of us, we will defend or help or whatever. So I guess the basis of a treaty is kind of an important one. And I guess Ukraine is currently not included in that. But I guess I'm thinking more along the lines of, can kind of non-democratic states with dictatorships, can democratic states even compete against such states? I think that's a really, really interesting ideological question, because when you have a country that is not abiding by any laws, is that power a lot stronger sometimes than democratic states? And what do you do in that position where in a democracy you have to double check with treaties, double check with other people, with other countries, your allies, kind of figure everything out slowly in a kind of respective democratic way to make sure everyone is on board and everything is done according to the plan? That can often be a lot of a slower process than if you have a dictator who is like, go do this, and they just do it, right? So I'm curious about your thoughts on when you're in that situation, what kind of occurs where international laws out the window, respective laws out the window, and you have two very different states kind of vying for the same territory. What happens then? You know, in which one is
I mean,
democratic and
in
one is
most
not.
cases, if you recall a situation, yeah, in which, I mean, in most cases, if you look at the past, a lot of these things result in, global wars. Because I think and it's also very hard to define because what we understand as modern democracy is very different than, what modern democracy looked like under World War II, for example, right? Like Germany started attacking everyone. And, it's very hard to consider them a democracy, but at the end of the day, it's also very hard to consider any other country at that point a pure democracy. And, arguably right now, it's also very hard to consider any country a democracy because I think that definition fluctuates based on the country, based on the kind of situation and what we're talking about. But kind of referring directly to what you said, if considering Russia a non-democracy and far different to those kind of Western countries, I mean, I'd say that usually results in war because it's hard to, even with like NATO or those treaties, a lot of them are based on, military relationships. If Russia was to attack Poland, US would attack Russia. And I think, it's very hard to kind of figure out a different way because, on a kind of more micro perspective, you can figure those things out in, like open conversations or, even debate if you're talking about these situations within a state or even, on a much smaller scale as well. But when it comes to talking about global countries just attacking each other, it's very hard to do anything other than attack the other country. Because at the end of the day, it's like on a global scale, it's very hard to, just come and I don't call Vladimir Putin and be like, let's please stop the war. It's very hard
Right.
to have like open and peaceful conversations when you disagree on the very fundamental topic in question.
Right, very well said. Yeah, I think that's very well said. I also find this topic in your paper of self-determination to be quite interesting. Can a state self-determine? Can they, I guess we see concepts we see examples of this crop up all the time, even in, the 1700s when the US self-determined themselves as their own country and they broke free of English rule. So I think this idea of self-determination, even when you're saying, like, for example, with Crimea, this kind of idea was corrupted, where they kind of argued that Crimeans wanted to be under Russian rule, and they did self-determine this. Or in other instances where it's not corrupted, where, for example, Haitian resistance broke free of French rule, or U.S. resistance broke free of British rule. I'm curious what you think of this idea of self-determination and its relation to global politics and international law, in your paper or in general. Yeah, what do you think about this idea of self-determination? Why is it important, and does it work, and should it have a place in international law? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very tricky because the way that we talk about self-determination, a lot of people refer to Scotland, for example, because
Mm,
it's not entirely independent. And, a lot of people talk about that. And I think that's a bit more relevant example when it comes to that being conducted in a true democracy. When, the result of the referendum is kind of half-half and you're not really where you stand. But kind of referring to the topic of my paper, when it comes to self-determination, I think it's a bit more important when it comes to those smaller states. Because I think countries that, still have control over one another, they do remain a bit more, still a bit more independent. I also like to think of the example of the UK and Malta because Malta wasn't exactly very happy to, let go of being a part of the Commonwealth. So I think, it's a very complex topic, but when it comes to self-determination directly and sorry, and smaller states in particular, I think it's very important because a lot of those bigger states tend to abuse those smaller countries, where they're just thrown around. And I think that's the case with more kind of global wars where that happened a lot during World War II and World War I, where you have those little segments of countries, where, some day they're, a part of Germany and the other they're a part of Poland because, they're so close to each other and they're just easy to throw around. So I think, in that sense, I think that's where the principle of territorial integrity comes in. But in that sense, I think self-determination is very important. But I think it's more so important nowadays if you think about actual abuse. Um, but at the same time, I do think since a lot of the countries in our world presently, and you mentioned global politics, they do remain democratic. And I think, it's a lot easier to find independence with the help of other states as well. Like in the case of Crimea, obviously they weren't very the West wasn't very helpful in 2014, but I still think they did receive some help. And Crimea, as of now, well, it is considered to be Russian by some states. In practice, it obviously I think in relevance to the ongoing war, that's harder to determine. But in practice, before the war, kind of in between the 2014 crisis and the start of the war in 2022, I think, and wasn't necessarily put in practice as much because Crimea was kind of, it isn't entirely Ukrainian, but isn't entirely Russian.
Mm.
And I think, it's important to retain that segment of territorial integrity when we think of self-determination, because it's very easily manipulated. Like I didn't mention that in my paper as much, but I personally think that the referendum was largely rigged. But since, I didn't want to kind of base my paper on anecdotal evidence, which I got from, you know, very secondary sources and, journalistic articles,
Right.
um, it's important to retain that kind of idea of the country may want to self-determine itself, but it also may look like they just want to self-determine themselves. So I think it's important to remember both and then find that nuance where, the country can be independent, but we also don't want them to, be abused by other countries, but we still want them obviously to be independent.
Right. Yeah, I guess it takes a kind of measure of experience and power to exist as a country in your own right, I guess, as well. Kind of like how you're saying. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think your thoughts on this issue are really, really fascinating, really on the nose. And I'm curious, so how did you conduct your research for this paper? Did you go through, as you were saying, like journalistic articles, other scholars' opinions, or was it also a mix of that and data, or how did you kind of conduct this research?
So I mean, primarily I looked at kind of academic literature, but I also tried to look at journalistic articles a bit because I think obviously a lot of that very academic literature doesn't look at personal or like more anecdotal evidence, which as much as I think, isn't very hardcore evidence, I shouldn't base my argument on that. It was important to take that into consideration. Because for instance, there were instances where people would say that they voted for integration and then later on would tell journalists that they voted otherwise. And I mentioned that in my paper as a part of the report that the BBC conducted in 2014. And I
Mm.
thought that was important for my paper to make cohesive sense. But at the same time, I didn't base my argument on that. But I did look at primarily secondary articles and then some primary, more quantitative data when it comes to the ethnic makeup of the region and the kind of the direct breakdown of the Russian speakers in Crimea or, the kind of ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, which I think was very relevant when it also comes to self-determination and territorial integrity. And I also kind of read a couple of books on the topic, on the history of Russia, history of Crimea, which I believe kind of gave me also some background. But yeah, overall, I just kind of looked at academic articles, some primary data, and also at those journalistic articles that I mentioned.
This is a really, really well researched topic. I actually really commend you for doing this. You're only 17. This is actually really brilliant. I would actually love
Yeah.
to read it. So, no, this is, I think, a lot of interesting issues you're touching on. I think it's a very complex issue, especially when you're mentioning how kind of there's a heterogeneous ethnic makeup in the region where you have Turkic peoples, you have Ukrainian peoples, you have Russian peoples, different languages are spoken, you have indigenous peoples. What happens then? Who has the right to control that land? Is the initial kind of reaction, the initial referendum, enough to change who has the right to control that land, especially if it's rigged or corrupted? Maybe not, right? So I think that's a really complex issue, and as international affairs often are, um, But yeah, I guess my last question for you today, before you finish our time, is do you have any kind of tips and tricks for other students who are maybe beginning to conduct a similar research project to yourself, either a similar topic or an entirely different one with CCIR? Do you have any kind of advice or tips for anyone just starting a similar project?
I'd say it's important to kind of to be relatively neutral when you come into kind of the very first stages of writing the paper. Because for me, my immediate thoughts that were that it's legal by international law, illegal by a respective law. I completely, I wasn't very aware of the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity. So, but when it comes to the kind of the things that I was thinking about when it comes to, international or respective law, I think they were pretty general. And, I wished I kind of didn't have these assumptions at first because it did cost me some time in the end. I had to rewrite my sections a couple of times because, I kind of based it on my assumptions at first. But I'd say, if you're very interested in a very specific topic, or maybe if you completely aren't, I think such a topic, or sorry, such a program really helps you kind of develop in that very specific academic sphere. And for me, it kind of also matches the previous topic of my paper, which was really interesting to add on because now I'm a lot more knowledgeable on both of the topics. And but I'd say, if you're interested, I'd say just do it and see where it goes because I was very confused at the beginning as well when it comes to my topic. I changed it a couple of times, the kind of the criteria and the theory at the very beginning were very different than what they ended up being in the end. But if you're interested, I'd say just stay open to new ideas and don't come in with very specific assumptions. And yeah, if you're interested, just apply and yeah.
Well, I think that is very brilliant advice. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been really, really fascinating, and I think this paper should definitely be published one day. I hope it will be. I think international law is some of the most complex
Yeah.
issues on the face of this planet, even more complex than medicine and STEM oftentimes. So I very much commend you for the research that you've undertaken with this project, and I think it sounds absolutely stellar. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. I think that's all the time we have. But yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank
So
you so much,
yeah.
and thank you for having me.